That hydrogen superpower, that is a piss weak hydrogen superpower scenario. I've got a much bigger scenario in my spreadsheet.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'm delighted to be joined by my two co-hosts, e-scooter aficionado Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Thank you for that sly reference to our transport activities in Germany the last few weeks. Lovely to be with you, and I am here on Gadigal land.
And card-carrying member of Australia's energy Twitterati, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
My card is still coming back from the print shop, but I'm looking forward to flashing it at people and observing their befuddled expressions.
On this week's show, we take a look at the Australian Energy Market Operator's 2022 Integrated System Plan and the big investments it says are needed to smooth the pathway towards a 21st century energy system. But before we get into all of that, this is our fourth episode. That means that there's 3 episodes out in the world, and we've got follow-up on some of the things that we covered in our previous episodes. Frankie, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I received a lovely email from Laura Hamilton O'Hara, who heads up the Living Future Institute of Australia. Now, they administer the Living Building Challenge rating scheme here. It's a sustainability rating for buildings. And she got in touch to say she really enjoyed the industry episode we did, the IPCC report one.
Our inaugural episode, right?
Our very first baby burst into the podcast world. And she was mentioning that she enjoyed the conversation around circular economy and our commentary around nutrition labels for products, and having a form of labelling system that spoke to embodied carbon content in different products. But she was at pains to point out that they already administer a labelling system called the Declare Material Transparency label as a part of their Living Building Challenge scheme, which is great. So there are a number of really good voluntary initiatives out there. And she let me know that their label, which sort of goes through where does a product come from, what's it made of, where does it go at the end of its life, has just recently started to include an embodied carbon metric as well. So that's very exciting.
Well, it's definitely exciting in the context of various efforts that are pushing this direction. National Australian Built Environment Rating System also doing some work in this space. I imagine there's going to have to be a lot of experimentation. It's a fairly thorny issue how to transparently disclose carbon content in a consistent way. So as many smart people working on it as once, Frankie, has got to be a good thing.
Yeah, and I think everyone would agree that it would be better to be working in partnership with each other than having same but slightly different schemes out there. And I know a lot of the industry people I talk to have a preference for something that's ultimately owned by government that then can be a foundation for other forms of policy intervention along the lines of what we talked about in that episode.
Yeah, cool. Hey, Tennant, I was included in a long Twitter thread related to another of our episodes on hydrogen, episode 3. What were the people saying about our opinions about hydrogen transport?
People have got strong feelings about hydrogen transport. They're related to their strong feelings about hydrogen in general. There were some people saying, why would you bother making it at all, let alone shipping it somewhere? But actually, I was this past week at the Sydney Energy Forum, where there was a lot of discussion of hydrogen for our region, for Australia, for Japan, and some remarkably consistent views coming from the various international energy experts, transport people and others at that conference. They're consistent with the IRENA report, basically saying, look, ammonia is the most plausible avenue for these exports if they're going to come about. I would qualify that, though, by saying there is still some room for technological surprise. And CSIRO people at the conference told me that they were excited about a technology they're working on, which sounds like it might be some way off, but is potentially game-changing, storing hydrogen in a solid matrix at high density but pretty reasonable pressures and temperatures. Actual sciencey physics type people will have a better opinion on the prospects of that than me, but maybe future editions of the IRENA report will have more to say. Oh, and we should say that the mysterious part 1 of the report trilogy that we reported on part 2 of came out eventually. It came out well after parts 2 and 3 for reasons best known to IRENA. But you can get them all at the International Renewable Energy Agency's website, and we'll put that in the show notes.
I did think it was particularly galling that they released it about 24 hours after our episode went live.
This is how we get results.
I think we should claim that, right?
The first result of one of our soon-to-be trademark epic rants.
Luke, I think there's one more result that we got as a result of our previous episode. So do you want to claim the credit for that?
Well, it's gas substitution roadmap corner. Do we get to keep a corner? Is this the final segment in the gas substitution roadmap odyssey?
But wait, there's more. I hear there's a major update coming next year.
So there was a bit of back and forth. I think in episode 1, Tennant, you said that you were excited about the
I was excited.
Impending release of the gas substitution roadmap. By episode 2, you were expressing concern that it may not be appearing on schedule.
And lo and behold, we have only to express the hope, and then
it appears. And so, yes, the influence of this podcast knows no bounds. Clearly, the Victorian government had thought better of their reticence, such as it was, given it was just a rumour, and they did release the gas substitution roadmap to some interest, acclaim, opprobrium, depending on where you sit in the energy debate. But that was out and about a couple of weeks ago, and it makes for an interesting read.
Maybe a topic for a future podcast.
Good little follow-up segment, and the good news is that if you have any more follow-up, any more thoughts, any comments, any interjections, if you're yelling at the podcast and you need to find a place to put your energy and enthusiasm, we now have an email address. Mailbag at letmesumup.net is where you can send your questions, comments, suggestions on papers we should cover for the show, intelligence, dare I say it, on the manoeuvrings of the Shadow Antonese government, all of the above. Send them to mailbag at letmesumup.net. Shall we integrate the system plan?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Australia is in the midst of a massive transformation in its energy mix as we move from a handful of large centralised thermal power stations to a sprawling portfolio of wind and solar generators peppered across Australia's paddocks and suburbs. Managing this transition is no small task and will require big investments in supply-side infrastructure, especially the poles and wires that get renewable electricity from where it is generated to where we need it. But how do we make sure we are making the right investments in the right infrastructure at the right time? Well, that's where the Australian Energy Market Operator's Integrated System Plan comes in. Every 2 years, AEMO releases an ISP, which provides both a rolling view on where we're going in terms of energy system transformation and a framework and rationale for investments in Australia's electricity infrastructure. The 2022 ISP just came out, and I think I speak for all of us when I say we're here for it. But, Tennant, what did you think of the latest ISP?
I had a ball with the ISP for a 120-plus page detailed look at electricity transmission and other things. It's a bit of a page-turner. Shout out to our friend of the podcast, energy luminary Dylan McConnell, who suggested that we do this one. There's a lot in the ISP. So, yeah, broadly, its job is to identify the best way for the electricity system to develop to meet the needs that we have of it. They call that the optimal development path, and to identify what they call the development opportunities to meet it. That is, what stuff do we need on the generation side, storage, demand side, and transmission. Now, it does include all of that stuff in the modelling work and the analysis, but really the origin of this thing, the product that it is adapted from, is very transmission oriented, and that's where this document is the most connected to crunchy processes that actually do things. The ISP is a big influence on economic regulation decisions about whether this or that transmission line is needed and is going to get built or not.
Indeed, the whole back half, probably the last third of the paper, is effectively a case for, the optimum development pathway that this whole huge modelling exercise has landed on it. And really, engaging with folk that may sort of have nits to pick with where AEMO has landed, right?
Well, I hear that people don't like great big honking transmission lines. They don't like them when they're right next to them, and they don't like them when they're far away but they're paying for them. So
that's right.
There's some people who are not friends of transmission out there, but none of them live at AEMO.
Maybe the obvious thing we should point out here, and like everyone who works in this space knows this intimately, but for those that don't, a lot of the investments that are detailed in this plan are paid for by consumers of the NEM. So that this is the network component of your energy bill. It can constitute up to about 40% or so of the money that you pay for energy. Goes towards funding these projects. So they're very important, but they're also a pretty significant part of the bill that you pay every quarter.
Yes, although most of that, to be fair, is for the distribution network, the poles and wires, rather than the mega huge towers stretching across great swathes of the countryside. So there is a lot in here, but broadly, the ISP considers 4 scenarios for the circumstances, political, economic, technological, market development that the energy system or the electricity system may have to deal with, and they call those slow change, where there's a loss of industry, there's not so much happening in terms of decarbonisation, at least for a long time. Progressive change, where we're heading for net zero, but we're doing quite a lot of it right at the end. Step change, where we've got a dramatic escalation in local and global climate ambition and quite deep transformation, including on the demand side, and hydrogen superpower, which is step change plus a gigantic new hydrogen industry.
Isn't it interesting that hydrogen got the cool scenario name?
That's true.
All the others are just like, these different types of change, and then hydrogen superpower.
That's true. And I was consulted on a parallel process where some of the good people at Transgrid were coming up with their own scenario names. And look, they were much more creative. They had one that was all about new technology transmission lines crossing the country, and they called that the DC universe. So, well done, Transgrid. Pull your socks up, AEMO.
So while we're dealing with the scenarios, there was a 5th scenario that got dropped at some point in the last 12 months. I understand because the previous federal government's commitment to net zero by 2050 made that a bipartisan commitment. I can't remember what it was called, Tennant.
I think it was the steady change.
Steady change didn't get us to net zero by 2050, and the consensus was, so we're only going to look at scenarios that get us to net zero, and so that one was dropped from the ledger, right?
Yeah, and all scenarios are not created equal. So they've part of this ISP development process is testing the scenarios with stakeholders. And stakeholders have decided by a majority that step change is now the central scenario, and slow change, it's in there, but it's probabilistically downweighted, like to a large degree. It's not playing a huge role in the ensemble. So like step change is where it's at, and that's a big change from the 2020 flavour of the ISP. And I'll just give you a couple of stats for what step change means. So coal-fired electricity generation retires way faster than the publicly announced dates. Half of it is gone by 2030. All of it's gone not long after 2040. Renewables energy hits 83% of the NEM by 2030. Electricity demand doubles by 2050, mostly due to electrification. In that central scenario, much more demand in the hydrogen superpower. 9 times growth in large-scale variable renewables, and 5 times growth in rooftop solar, which is meeting nearly 20% of underlying demand by 2050. The firming capacity has to increase, triple the firming we have today, 46 gigawatts and 640 gigawatt hours of dispatchable storage of all sorts. Snowy 2 is 2 gigawatts versus 46 gigawatts, although it is 350 gigawatt hours, so more than half of the volume of energy storage as opposed to dispatchable capacity that's in that scenario. 7 gigawatts existing hydro, 10 gigawatts of gas-fired generation required by 2050 and throughout, and 10,000 kilometres more transmission lines. So this thing is big. We'll come back to maybe whether it's as big as it needs to be, but it is bloody big.
I guess they're not mucking around when they frame this report by saying this is really a once-in-a-century transformation of the way that electricity is generated and consumed. And they talk about that double transformation, right? So it's not just that we're replacing aging fossil fuel infrastructure with firmed renewables. It's also that we're electrifying the economy at the same time. So all those things happening at the same time creates a lot of complexity. When you were talking about the scenarios and sort of stepping them out and the process that they went through with stakeholders to determine which is more likely, didn't you think it was fascinating that they had their panel of experts meet, I think it was like October 2021, and they were sort of roughly split like a third each on progressive change and step change as the most likely scenario. And then they got the same people back together in November after COP26.
Yes.
And then it jumped to 50%. Were suggesting that step change is now the preferred scenario. Like in the space of less than a month, you already saw that proportion of people's opinions shift on what's more likely. I think that, to me, perfectly encapsulated all the language in this document, which is around the fact that this is an irreversible, accelerating transformation that we're witnessing.
And that, talk fests actually have an impact.
Going to your point about the difference in tone and ambition in this document versus the 2020 document, I even think back to 2018, the first ISP, and the kind of the conversation that there was around that. The abiding memory I have about that was that ISP arguing that we need to keep the existing coal in the system for as long as possible, like it needs to be there until the end of its allotted life, so that we can effectively manage that transition. And here we are 4 years later, and AEMO is saying, well, we actually don't believe the stated closure dates of the coal that's there. We think it's going to be exiting the system much quicker for all kinds of reasons, it's not worth repairing. There's for underlying commercial reasons. It just simply doesn't make sense to run the coal-fired power stations. You've got, wars in Ukraine, doing crazy things to fuel costs. There's all of these swirling maelstrom of factors says we don't trust the coal's going to be there, and really using that as a case of saying, well, we need to build this transmission infrastructure as quickly as possible as almost an insurance policy against those coal-fired generators exiting sooner than they say they will, which is a remarkable shift in just 4 years.
Yeah, and the role that this ISP is playing, that any of the ISPs play, has really shifted over this time. So I would say that for much of the last couple of years, the ISP was providing sort of secretly or less than overtly, was providing a bit of a game plan for energy ministers of all governments for what they thought might well happen but weren't willing to embrace publicly, but what they needed to prepare for. Now it's sort of transformed into this this vehicle through which we agree that it is happening, and explicitly, and in preparing for it, kind of make it happen. But it is strange because there are a lot of factors that suggest these sorts of retirements will happen. There's nothing that makes them happen at this point, and maybe there will be, but it's sort of a becoming a collective act of self-hypnosis. Like if you take the ISP and you say, well, this is the most likely, we better get ready for it, then it is real. It's odd, and it's turned into a substitute. Certainly it had, under the previous federal government, a substitute for a really clear expression of political will to make things happen.
Well, that's what I want to get to, because Frankie referenced the group of stakeholders that come together, obviously an incredible group of experts whose opinion I think AEMO should be taking into account, and it's appropriate to have that sort of body to inform their views about what the most likely scenario is. But there are these little things called elected governments, which, one might think might have a view on, what the most appropriate pathway forward, taking into account the economic, social and environmental costs, and that they might be well placed to decide what the scenario that they wish to pursue is, which goes to your point, Tennant, which is it's sort of like we're all sort of being absorbed into this time stream.
I will say I've spoken with like a person on the making clean energy happen side of things who's like very excited about renewables and like looks at the ISP and say, I don't see yet the pieces being in place for step change to happen. I don't see the conditions for renewables to grow that fast. What am I missing? And I think what they're missing is the self-reflexive quality of this, where putting it down in as the central scenario does in fact change public investment, changes public policy, changes regulatory decisions about what gets built and what doesn't, and it does to a significant extent make it happen.
And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that a step change scenario is not something that, governments could plausibly say, well, that is the right pathway forward. It's just it would just be better on a whole range of fronts in terms of social licence, the democratic process, to have that sort of that clear deliberation from our elected representatives to say, well, balancing all these various factors, this is the pathway we wish to pursue. I wonder if it reflects to some degree how difficult these political calculations are, and it is in some ways easier to defer to an expert body that's external to government to think through some of these issues and then effectively, in a de facto way, come to a conclusion about the pathway that we're travelling down. whether that can be maintained as we work through the next 20 years, I'm somewhat sceptical of. But maybe coming out of a decade which has been incredibly contested when it comes to energy and climate policy, this has been a useful vehicle for giving us a space to think through some of this stuff, so that, you know, in a context of, you know, a recent meeting of energy ministers, which by all accounts was a very productive one, where everybody found that they were more or less on the same page. You know, the page is to some degree one that AEMO wrote.
Yep.
And had they not written it, the page would probably be a bit blank. Which wouldn't have been particularly helpful.
Or full of very random things that occurred to all of the individual governments who, you know, their hearts are in the right place, but they have not been coordinating that well with each other.
I also think some of the rationale for how this newly elected federal government has chosen really to focus in on transmission, the things that connect, you know, all the different areas of generation across the NEM, which includes multiple states, together, because individually, you know, I wouldn't be so unfair to the states. I think in the absence of much stronger, you know, leadership that we were talking about from the federal government, states have really leaned in and, you know, sought to progress policies around renewable energy zones, and, you know, and this ISP certainly talks to that. But it's how those things are all going to work together through a more well-planned transmission network is where this new federal government has really pitched itself in the rewiring of the nation piece. So I guess, not wanting to at all speak for them, but, you know, the federal RET had largely done its job in the sense of bringing down the cost of large-scale renewables, and the business case for those stacks up. Well, now it's just about making sure that new generation, from a location perspective, is directed appropriately and then linked properly. I say this not at all focused on this sort of area of policy in my day job, but I just found that that the interesting side of all this, that the feds have really claimed the transmission space, like the leadership, and AEMO seems only too happy about that in this document, from what I can tell.
It maybe goes to this, the folk that have been doing this thinking are then in a position to influence the where people's minds go in terms of policy making, because there has been all of this work and this thinking and this a lot of modelling and a lot of stakeholder engagement focused on the transmission needs for the nation. And I think that's a really good thing, because I think we will most likely need to spend quite a lot of money on transmission infrastructure, and it is absolutely appropriate that we think deeply about that and do the best we can to make good investment decisions, and that requires the application of a lot of time and attention. But the issue I have is that there's all of these other areas which also need investment and good thinking and policy making, which are not getting an equivalent amount of attention. So it's like, you know, going to the gym and, you know, really working those biceps and just, you know, wandering around on very spindly legs. And there's a little bit of a sense in which the bodybuilding that we've been doing from a policy making sense in terms of energy specifically is a little bit out of whack. And I think specifically about there are scenarios in terms of energy efficiency that are reflected in the different scenarios. There are inputs into that. It actually varies from scenario to scenario how much energy efficiency is happening, and I haven't dug into the models to understand exactly, you know, how AEMO has arrived at those different levels of ambition in terms of terawatt hour reductions in different scenarios, but the reality is that it's certainly not foregrounded in the narrative of the report, and that were this or an equivalent exercise to foreground that, one would find that depending on the level of ambition in terms of policy making around energy efficiency, it would likely have very profound implications for the amount of spending you needed to do on the supply side. And so, you know, it goes to the fact not that this is a waste of time or shouldn't be happening or anything like that. It's just that there is a bunch of equivalent exercises that ultimately need to be done. It's almost like, Tennant, we need like a supercharged ISP.
Well, I've heard that there's a request for such a thing from a little group that used to be called COAG Energy Council and then was called the National Cabinet Energy Reform Committee, and I don't know what they're called now, but they've got energy ministers in them.
Yes.
And they want a bigger ISP, although the request is a bit vague at the moment. But like the thing that a bigger ISP needs, the thing that this ISP needs really, is to plug in a bit more directly to decision making and policy development and regulatory processes around all those other things. Like there is, as we said earlier, there is a transmission economic regulation process that this very concretely informs. The fact that this exercise finds that actionable projects are the Hume link to connect up Snowy 2 and strengthen Victoria to New South Wales connections, the Sydney Ring, the New England Res link, the Marinus link lines 1 and 2, and the Victoria New South Wales interconnector via Kerrang, VNI West. All of those things are almost certainly going to happen because the ISP says they should happen. Now, where is the process that this connects to for distributed energy resource development? Not just the how do we make things play nice policy reform process, but decisions on how much incentive or how much investment there's going to be in those things. Ditto on energy efficiency, ditto on transport electrification, on the future of gas. There are decisions being taken that affect those things, but they're not yet plugged into the ISP in as meaningful a way as transmission is.
Coming from a built environment perspective, looking at this, I have looked at some of the more detailed modelling assumptions on this because it's relevant for other work that I'm looking at. And in this central scenario of step change, the assumption is I think about 80% of households have electrified by 2040. Now, that's not going to happen on its own.
Well, Vladimir Putin's doing his bit to help.
Well, yeah, so when we should circle back to that. But 2040 is not far away. And even if you turned around and said from the next building code upgrade, only all electric buildings moving forward, that still wouldn't get you anywhere near that level of electrification by 2040 because you're only incrementally adding very small percentages of new homes to the building stock year on year. So for mine, it assumes an awful lot of progressive policy that's not yet in place. And Luke, to your point on energy efficiency policy, it does say in the ISP that it takes into account existing energy efficiency policies that are there. So like in my area, it specifically references building codes and things like that as well. It's basically just banking that. So it's talking about the fact that we've got a trajectory for low energy buildings, and that includes progressively ratcheting up requirements for energy efficiency. My take on this is it's just banking those and assumes it's going to happen.
So I don't think any of us are suggesting that there's anything inherently wrong with the exercise, which is the ISP.
It's badly needed.
In its own terms, it continues to play an important role in decision-making around that investment in that transmission infrastructure. It makes sense that some of those things are not necessarily foregrounded or treated with the level of depth or attention that perhaps we're suggesting they should be. But I guess what we're saying is that needs to be done somewhere, whether it's through this supercharged ISP, which energy ministers have indicated that they wish to see, or through some other effort. I think that'll be really important. The one extra thing I'll add onto the to-do list for the poor people that are going to be producing this much broader document, something that we've all talked about offline, which is, yes, electrification, sure, that's a great idea. The quality of electrification really matters a lot. Yeah. The efficiency of the electric appliances that you're transitioning to, and also ensuring that they're using energy at the right time of day, where it's not just a demand response capability, which is that rapid response, but also just that they are shaping their load to likely patterns of generation availability in the NEM, which again, if you do that properly, then it potentially has profound implications for how much supply side infrastructure you need to build to accommodate said electrification.
And if you don't, it goes the other way. And they do assume that there is good consultation of electrified assets that are in the model.
Yep.
They identify that there is some work to be done to ensure that's actually the case. But boy, is there. There is a lot to be done. And frankly, there's a lot to be done just to achieve what is in here already. Like the transmission stuff, they single out social license issues as really important. And they say, well, there's work happening, and the work needs to succeed because we need these transmission assets as soon as we could deliver them. The dates that they put in for them to be delivered by, in many cases, the model says it would be efficient to build them earlier. They just don't believe it's physically possible or regulatorily possible. Anything that can be done to speed up these projects, AEMO is saying, should be done. But people don't like them. So there is some risk there.
It's not just the social license piece. It's social license, it's skills and it's supply chains. So supply chains in terms of just getting the materials to build the stuff, skills. Obviously we're going through a skills crisis in Australia, and in particular in the energy sector. Having the available skills to build up these infrastructure projects, and the interaction with just the broader infrastructure agenda in Australia.
Out to 2030, there are a lot of other countries that are decarbonising their energy system alongside Australia. So it's not as though we're the only country that might have extra demand for the steel and the concrete and the highly specialised electrical components needed to make hydrogen electrolyzers and, all the things that go into substations and transmission infrastructure, that we're competing in a global marketplace for these things. In 2022, understandably, they're very worried about the uncertainty in this, in supply chains over the next decade, when a lot of these significant not just transmission but generation projects need to ramp up.
That's right. There's so much more stuff that the world needs to do, for every country to do its own version of this transition. And the current global supply chain problems are not caused by the energy transition, but future problems in energy-specific supply chains could absolutely come up from mishandling of parts of this by not just by us, by any major economy. And also, like the step changes are like, those were big numbers I rattled off before, but this is definitely not as big as it gets. Like step change is more or less consistent with the net zero emissions electricity sector by 2050. It's not a net zero Australia by 2050, and it's definitely not a net zero world by 2050 scenario. Hydrogen superpower adds in a little bit more of that, but we may wind up needing even more giant transmission lines to everywhere and back, and more distributed energy, and more of everything. Net Zero Australia is a big deal.
I also want to do a very quick shout out to friend of the pod and personal friend Jonathan Cartledge, JC, who's headed up policy and research at Infrastructure Australia for the last little while. Their market capacity report is referenced in the ISP a few times, and what that really does is articulate the jobs shortfall that we're talking about I think, in general, in terms of infrastructure-connected labour, but they also did a special report on the energy sector as well. I think, yes, for the sake of completeness, it's called Market Capacity for Electricity Infrastructure. They say that we basically need between 80,000 and 95,000 people over the next 15 years to deliver the energy-related infrastructure that's articulated in the ISP, which is a staggering number of people.
The overwhelming sort of sense I took away from this document is that there is a very clear view from AEMO that we need these infrastructure projects.
Yes.
There are no doubt whatsoever, and they've done the analysis. Yes, in the step change scenario, these make sense, but you know what? In all of 4 scenarios that modelled, these make sense.
They're robust to a range of scenarios.
Right. So they are convinced that these need to happen. They are also, I think, very confident that the review processes that they need to step through to get these investments done, that they can work through.
Yes.
The thing they're worried about is them actually physically being able to be built. Because of the skills, the supply chains and the social licence. And they're worried that, coal-fired generators exit the market, they don't have this transmission infrastructure built, and we all go to hell in a handbasket.
And AEMO gets blamed first. First up against the wall.
Frankie, Tennant, anything else you want to chip in on?
So is gas generation critical to this ISP, or is it a small part of this ISP? Spoiler alert, I'm going to say yes.
I was going to be more specific and say both.
So there was a bit of a flap.
Who wants to explain the flap?
I'm happy to explain the flap. The gas industry said AEMO finds gas is critical, and gas critics said that's rubbish, that's untrue. AEMO finds that gas is a very small part of the electricity system, and they're probably wrong. It's probably not even that. And what AEMO says themselves, a little more fulsomely, is that while the total volume of energy in the electricity system coming from gas is not that big, it's not that big now, and it's even less big in 2050, that in the total suite of flexibility that their model needs to rely on to meet, kick all the goals required of the electricity system, gas peakers are, or something that operates very like a gas peaker, is really important. Whether it's burning gas or it's burning hydrogen or a blend or biogas or whatever, that you need some stuff that is sitting there and is not too expensive to build, and who cares if it's expensive to operate, because it's there for the times when nothing else is available, especially these dark still periods, Dunkelflaute, renewables droughts, whatever you call them, rare events when you've got low wind and high demand and little sunlight for a while, and you want something that can run and run, however much it costs when it's there. Batteries aren't a great fit for that particular use case. Pumped hydro isn't. Gas currently is. Maybe hydrogen peakers in the future.
The role of gas, particularly 2040 onwards, it was very modest, right, in the context of the entire energy system. And you said, Tennant, that there's a bit less gas being used in those out years than there is now. That's in the context of a much larger energy system in terms of overall capacity.
Yes.
Right? And so as a percentage, it's actually going down quite significantly. I feel pretty sanguine, to be honest, in this massive transformation that is being contemplated, that technology is remaining in the mix. But I don't think we should overstate the degree to which it's playing a central role in the transition.
Yeah, look, I would say it's playing an insurance role fundamentally. And I don't derive currently any of my income from life insurance. I wouldn't say that life insurance, however, is anything but critical. It actually is an important thing to have there in case I need it. It's small but critical.
These ISPs are put out every 2 years, and I mean, I was looking at that and going, I wonder if that will change over the next coming years. You don't think the more interesting numbers that are related to this that really struck me in reading it was that they recognise that virtual power plants, so this is distributed energy connected by smarts, whether that's across a bunch of industrial rooftops with, sort of medium-sized solar installations or things of that nature, vehicle-to-grid services and other emerging technologies, in quotation marks, are projected to provide 31 gigawatts of dispatchable storage capacity, and utility-scale batteries and pumped hydro are only giving 16 gigawatts. Compared to where we are today, that's an enormous growth in distributed dispatchable storage capacity out there that isn't currently there at all. And to me, that's a far more interesting, development to focus on over the next couple of decades. The role of EVs, not just drawing from the grid, and we talked about, one, having the smarts, in them to start with to make sure they can charge at the right times of day, or even policy incentives like tax incentives or something to make sure that you do charge during the middle of the day when there's plenty of cheap solar. But that, all those things are going to be in the mix in a way that's, not at all visible at the moment. I think is really exciting.
A little daunting too, because those things are much easier to write into a model than they are to achieve in real life.
Yeah.
Well, both from a technology perspective and also just a regulatory / market / aggregation, how that all comes together, that is just like castles out of clouds at this point, right?
Yes.
And so it goes to the challenge which is before us, which is not just a challenge of rolling out stuff in the world. It's the challenge of creating a system, an integrated system, if you will, whereby all of this stuff can work together.
Good plan.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing, in which we share something that is currently captivating our attention. Frankie, what have you got?
I have the impending prospect of legislation being introduced to this new parliament within the first sitting fortnight to give effect to the government's 43% emissions reduction on 2005 levels by 2030 into law. It's causing a bit of discussion around the traps, isn't it? And by around the traps, I mean within the Greens. What I did want to draw our dear listeners' attention to were a couple of interviews that Adam Bandt, the leader of the Greens, has given the past few days. They'll still be pretty current by the time this podcast comes out. He gave a long-form interview with Catherine Murphy at The Guardian on their politics podcast, and he also appeared on Insiders on Sunday the 17th of July. And I think anyone who takes a keen interest in climate policy in Australia will be looking to see whether the Greens do indeed support the legislation of a 43% target, or whether they will vote against it because it's not as ambitious as the targets that they put in their platform, which I think was 75% by 2030. If I'm not mistaken.
Well, I'm going to take your rather passé discussion about, whether or not the Greens will back in this 43% target. There's a much more interesting debate arising in my home state of Victoria, which is the announcement today, as we record, that the Victorian Liberal Party, it reckons that Dan Andrews and his climate agenda is weak tea 2030 because he hasn't legislated a 2030 target, and if they win government in November, have committed to legislating a 50% emissions reduction target. So, this is the flavour of the month, the topic of the moment, and we now have the Liberal Party in Victoria throwing down the gauntlet.
Pretty interesting place to be. Very different from the politics of just a few years ago. 6 months ago, even.
6 minutes ago, even.
I'm going to name now two more things. The new one is that, Frankie, I'm waiting for Murph and Spearsy to return the favour by plugging this podcast in their small programs.
Oh, Tennant, you've set expectation very high now. Please, Murphy. Please, David Spears.
If you will it, dude, it is no dream. I am going to nominate, for my one more thing, a pretty nerdy thing that is very obtuse and technical, but pretty exciting. Trilogues taking place in the European Union over the remainder of this year. The trilogue is what happens when you have a parliament and a commission and a council of ministers that all separately come to their own decisions on what needs to happen, and then they all have to agree after that on how it actually will happen, and they have started the trilogues on the EU's Fit for 55 package. This is not a fitness regime. This is the plan for how the EU is going to cut its emissions to 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. And that's got expanding ETS, an expanding emissions trading scheme. It's got the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's got a lot of other interesting things in it. They have kicked those off. We can expect that they will complete them by the end of the year. They've got all of them strong positions in favour of doing big, exciting stuff. But there are some interesting nuances in there, including, is hydrogen, our old friend, going to be part of the scope of these carbon tariffs, the carbon border adjustment mechanism from the start? How hard are they going to push on the expanded emissions trading scheme to transport and heating of buildings? A lot of interesting stuff. So watch this space, trilogisticians. It's going to be a thrilling conclusion to a big policy process.
And Luke, I'm trusting that your little quip on my 43% target chat was not your one more thing. What else are you thinking about today?
It wasn't my one more thing. I'm going to do some shameless self-promotion, but Frankie, not just in my interests, in your interests as well, because of course we've just returned from a delegation on energy efficiency in buildings in Germany. There may be some listeners that don't know that this is my second foray into the wonderful world of podcasts. There is another podcast in which I am an active participant, First Fuel, and on that podcast, that other podcast that I'm on, Frankie and I and our good friend Carlos Flores got together a couple of weeks ago and chatted about some of the key outcomes of our delegation. And there was a big focus in that particular episode on the kind of the superstructure of German energy and climate policy making, the role of targets, not just economy-wide targets, but importantly sectoral targets, how those targets sort of help to shape and focus the minds of policymakers who are held accountable for not just achieving some target off in the never in 2030 or 2040, but year on year they're expected to, hit particular marks. And it was a super fun chat. So you won't hear Tennant, unfortunately, but it'll be almost like an episode of Let Me Sum Up with some rando ringing named Carlos Flores.
I'm a bit overexposed, to be frank. People could do with a bit less Tennant Reed in their lives, I think.
Oh, Luke, am I allowed to do this? Spoiler alert. We talked for so long about heat pumps and electrification. He had to make a second episode out of it.
That is true. It is my first bumper double episode of First Fuel. Yes. So the first episode is out this week. The other one will be out next week as we record. So you can check out the First Fuel podcast feed for all of that great content. Frankie, Tennant, is there anything else you wanted to throw out there before we wrap this one up?
Could we possibly fit anything more into this episode? I don't think so. I'm spent. The integrated system plan has done me in.
I think that's entirely fair. All right. Well, that is our show for today. We're all on Twitter. Frankie is at Frankie Muscovich, Tennant is at Tennant Reid, and my handle is at Luke Menzel. And you can email us with your feedback or something you want to cover on a future episode at mailbag@letmesumup.net. Never miss an episode by subscribing to Let Me Sum Up in your favourite podcast app, and you'll find this, all previous and all future episodes of the show at letmesumup.net. But for Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.